Hello and welcome to the December 2021 edition of the Pembrokeshire Bird Diary. I'm Annie Haycock from the Pembrokeshire Bird Group, here to share some of the highlights of the month. December is definitely a month of change. The wardens of Skomer Island had returned to the mainland at the end of November, while Skocom had to wait a little longer for a suitable weather window. So not much news from the islands this month. The highlight being 444 Mediterranean gulls in Broad Sound on the 1st, all adult or second winter birds, all heading west into the gales, along with over 1,000 kittiwakes and 1,375 black-headed gulls. It was the highest count before Richard and Giselle left the island on the 5th, in fact the highest ever count, but who knows how many could have been there later in the winter. There were fewer med gulls in Broad Sound the following day, but now the highlight was a brutish first winter glaucous gull, which was throwing its weight around in the middle of the throng. This is a surprisingly rare Skocom species. Indeed, there have only been 6 previous records, compared with sightings in most of the last 30 years on the mainland. Many of our lesser blackback gulls winter in Portugal, though Bob and I have failed to spot a Pembrokeshire ringed bird during any of our visits there. However, this bird turned up at the Gan, having been ringed in spring 2020 north of Porto. It has spent some time in the rehabilitation centre there after showing signs of intoxication, though we don't know intoxication by what. It had been seen on the Hale Estuary in Cornwall 3 days before arriving in Pembrokeshire. Dave Astins reported an adult Caspian Gull at the Gan on several dates, probably the same bird as at the end of November. However, it was definitely different to the one seen on Frains Lake Beach on the 19th. This was X290, also seen by Dave at the Gan last month and in November 2020, and before that by the late Sam Baxter at Newport back in July 2017. If you're still using an old field guide, Caspian Gulls may not be mentioned at all, or they may have been listed as a race of the herring gull. By the early 2000s, however, taxonomists were in agreement that the herring gull was actually 3 species: herring gull, yellow-legged gull and Caspian gull. Caspian gulls were thought to breed only locally around the Caspian Sea, as shown by this map from the first European breeding bird atlas. There was little information from east of that area at that time. The second breeding bird atlas shows a considerable expansion, perhaps helped by better knowledge of identification. X290 comes from a colony in eastern Germany. Caspian gulls aren't always easy to separate from the other species. Perhaps the first clue for adult birds is the dark eye. Yellow-legged gulls are a bit easier to identify, if only because they usually have obvious yellow legs. Up to 6 have been recorded together in the gull roost at the Rosebush Reservoir this month, and 4 at Lisa Fran, though not at the same time. They could well be the same birds seen at Goodwick Harbour, the Gan and Newport at other times of day. At Lisa Fran, Brian Southern and Co. reported gull roost counts of easily over 6,000 birds, with hundreds more still streaming in as it got too dark to count. At various times during the month, that meant over 5,000 lesser blackbacks, up to 2,500 black-headed gulls and over 100 common gulls, along with the usual complement of scarcer species. These scarcer species included a first winter Iceland Gull on the 16th and 19th. Another, or perhaps the same, first winter Iceland Gull was at Pembroke Castle Pond on the 29th. Initially it was resting with herring gulls, but then got caught up in a feeding frenzy with herring and black-headed gulls at the Mill Bridge. As the gull flies, it isn't too far to go to Lisa Fran for the night. Not all ringed gulls have nice bright colourings that makes them relatively easy to see. This black-headed gull at Pembroke Mill Pond on the 10th hung around for long enough for us to take photos from several angles and get the number from its metal ring. EA69458 had been ringed as a nestling at Rye Meads on the Hertfordshire-Essex border on the 5th of June 2021, 330 kilometres to the east of the mill pond. From other records posted on the blog, this appears to be the 4th ringed black-headed gull from southeast England to have been reported in Pembrokeshire during the last 3 years. The others were all ringed in Essex, and at least one of them, like this millpond bird, came from breeding colonies in the Lee Valley. Our last gull for this month is our smallest species. Toby Phelps saw a little gull at Wiseman's Bridge on the 1st. Then there was one at Fishguard Harbour on the 5th, and this photo was of one at the Gann on the 29th. The sharp-eyed amongst you will surely have noticed the Mediterranean gull lurking amongst the black-headed gulls in the water. On the subject of the Gann, new information boards have been installed to try and reduce the disturbance caused by people and dogs to birds on the Pickleridge pools and marshes. On the 16th we were at the Iron Bridge at Newport. It was fascinating to watch two little grebes feeding close to a domestic-type mallard. As the duck fed in the shallows, the grebes would dive down to snatch food that was being disturbed. Quite a nice example of kleptoparasitism. A flock of light-bellied Brent geese has become a regular winter sight at the Gann and Angle Bay as they commute between these two parts of the Cleddau Estuary complex. This year they've included a ringed bird, white C, blue T. We had quite a few sightings of 11 individual ringed geese between 2006 and 2018, but none since then until this one. They had all been ringed at Strangford Lough by the Irish Brent Goose Research Group, who have discovered that their birds move between Arctic Canada and Brittany in France, often via Greenland, Iceland and Wales, as well as various sites in Ireland. A different population of pale-bellied birds breeds on the Svalbard and Franz Josef Land to the north of Europe. This particular individual was ringed at Strangford Lough in December 2008 and has since been recorded mainly there and in Tralee Bay on the west side of Ireland in winter. It goes to Iceland in spring, probably en route to Arctic Canada. We've also had a couple of dark-bellied Brent geese this winter. This subspecies breeds along the North Russian coast, migrating to the northeast via the Baltic. Snipe are probably one of our most numerous waders in winter, but because they spend most of their time in grassland and reed beds away from open mudflats, it's very difficult to get a true picture of their numbers. The afternoon of the 16th was generally quiet at the Tivy marshes until a low-flying electricity company helicopter surveying power lines caused 3 separate flocks to appear out of the marsh. We estimated at least 250 snipe in the air at one time, a record number for the reserve. Also at the Tivy marshes, the pool near the car park has been extended and a sluice gate with an eel pass has been installed to better control the water levels, so it will be interesting to see what turns up there. Amongst the smaller birds reported this month, there was a rose-coloured starling visiting a garden in Haverfordwest from the end of November onwards. Siberian shift-chaffs were still hanging around, 2 firecrests in the Gwyne Valley and at Poppet, 3 snow buntings still on Fishguard out of Breakwater, and a yellow-browed warbler at the Gann that didn't want to be photographed. Also there was a brief sighting of a swallow at Amroth on the 19th. Black redstarts are regular winter visitors here, though not in large numbers. The Stackpole Centre is a regular site, and another was reported from Planachire in the Gwyne Valley. This one visited a bird feeder in Charles Matheson's garden, where he was able to film it. The highlight of a trip to Stackpole on the 3rd was a flock of at least 25 to 30 greenfinches that were starting to congregate in trees near the old brewery at about 3:30. It looked like a pre-roost gathering, and possibly others could have arrived by dusk. 30 to 40 years ago there used to be a fairly large winter gathering in nearby Lodge Park, in excess of 100 birds at times, but that was before the mature stands of laurel were removed. It seems likely that a roost still persists somewhere in the area. 25 plus is the largest flock we've seen for a while. In November, the pied wagtails that had been gathering at Withybush seemed to fly south, probably to roost somewhere closer to Haverfordwest town centre. This month, on the 11th, they were back at their usual roost site. As usual, many gathered on roofs and in a few nearby trees before gradually moving across to the roost. We estimated at least 360 birds had settled in by about 4:30. Well, that's a quick tour of December. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope you look out for the next edition.